what are the effects of migration on the UK's housing system? This is the focus of one of the chapters in the latest UK Housing Review, which is now out. For CIH Unlocked, I caught up with its author, John Perry, to find out more. The chapter your chapter, John, in the UK Housing Review, well, I think one of two chapters, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
Yes, 2.5 chapters.
2.5 chapters. Okay. Well, yeah, this chapter is titled "The Growth in Migration to the UK and Its Effects on Housing." Before we get into some of the questions, are you able to just give a bit of background to how this chapter came about?
We've looked at the migration issue in the UK Housing Review on a fairly regular basis, and we wanted to look at it again this year for two big main reasons. One is the sudden growth in migration that took place in 2022-23, with obvious questions about what its effect on housing might be, and also the controversy over the way that migrants are treated in the housing system, most notably the Home Secretary's treatment of asylum seekers.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted to bring together that sort of overview of what's happening to migrants and how they affect the housing system, and the way that parts of the migrant sector suffer very badly from the housing system as it stands.
Yeah. Starting off with quite a broad question then. How much pressure is migration currently putting on the UK's housing system?
The answer to the question of how much migrants put pressure on the housing system is a bit complicated, because, of course, migrants add to population growth. And in fact, most population growth in the UK comes from migration, because there's a rough balance between births and deaths. But this doesn't necessarily mean extra demand for houses, because households only form when people can buy or rent a house. And given the economic situation, household formation is relatively low. And until people can buy a house or rent a house, they share, whether it's young people staying with their parents for a longer time, or moving back in with their parents, or people sharing accommodation. So we're waiting to see what the government or the statistics bodies think will be the effect of migration on household formation. It probably will increase, but not in proportion to the recent growth in migration that we've seen.
Yeah, and it goes without saying that the UK is in a housing crisis. It's been in a housing crisis for quite some time now. Just wondering, to what extent are high profile and controversial alternative accommodation schemes such as the Bibby Stockholm barge, which you mentioned in the chapter, to what extent are these schemes kind of symptomatic of a housing system that just can't cope?
The problem with the asylum accommodation measures is trying to address is partly a housing problem, but it's also a problem of government administration. What the government have done is allowed a big backlog of asylum claims to build up. So there has been a modest growth in the number of people claiming asylum, but there's been a much faster growth in the number of claims in the system that haven't been addressed. And of course, most of the people who are in the system, or all of the people in the system, have to be accommodated while they're waiting. Some will make their own arrangements, but the majority require asylum accommodation, supported accommodation provided by the government, which is very basic accommodation indeed. But the problem is that the contractors who provide it are in competition with, for example, local authorities trying to get temporary accommodation, which we know there is very high demand for. And so the government has resorted to using hotels, which are much more expensive. And because of the millions of pounds being spent daily on hotels, it's now looking for more supposedly innovative solutions, like the Bibby Stockholm barge, regardless really of the effects that this kind of solution is going to have on the mental health or physical health of asylum seekers.
I also wanted to ask you about hosting arrangements. So that this is something the chapter talks about a little bit, specifically noting the Homes for Ukraine scheme. And I think the chapter talks a bit about how really these schemes are quite small, quite minimal. But if they were to become more widespread and rolled out more widely, would that help to ease the strain on the housing system?
Well, amongst a gloomy picture for the government's treatment of refugees and asylum seekers, there's one bright spot, which is their response to the Ukraine crisis, because the government, through the Department for Levelling Up Homes and Communities, Housing and Communities, has accommodated 200,000 Ukrainians since the war started there. And the vast majority have been accommodated through hosting arrangements, which have worked, in general, worked very well. There's now a degree of homelessness arising as the arrangements break down, but it's shown that this kind of scheme can work and that it can make use of spare space in the housing system during the housing crisis. So the question is, can this kind of scheme be applied more widely? And in the CIH, we would like it to be applied more widely. There are small hosting schemes for asylum seekers and for refugees whose asylum claims have been approved, but they operate on a very small scale. And we think there's an opportunity here for the government, the Home Secretary, working together with Michael Gove, or the Secretary of State for Housing, and roll out this kind of scheme on a longer term and wider basis.
A large focus of the chapter is the kind of the many difficulties that a lot of migrants experience when they do try to access housing in the UK. So you able to kind of elaborate on what these difficulties are for them?
The problems that migrants face who are coming to the UK for housing are in some ways the same as any low-income tenants trying to access the private rented sector. Obviously, most migrants who are new to the UK aren't eligible for housing from local authorities or housing associations, nor are they eligible for benefits. So those that are earning can access the private rented sector. They do have the advantage that they're not on benefits, so that they are not going to be discriminated against for being on benefits. But it's very likely they'll be discriminated against because they're migrants, because they don't have a track record in the sector. They may have problems in paying the deposit and so on. And in England, they face the right to rent test, which landlords have to apply to any tenant. But for a tenant from the UK or Ireland or from the European Union, the test is much simpler. They're just showing their passports. Whereas for a migrant in more complicated circumstances, the paperwork is more difficult. And it's known that landlords discriminate against migrants because they don't want to risk making mistakes and facing large fines from the government if they do so.
And this links to my next question, which is, to what extent are migrants more vulnerable to different forms of homelessness? I suppose especially in comparison to people who are born in the UK.
Well, certainly in the last year or two, there's been a crisis of homelessness amongst refugees whose claims are approved by the Home Office, and most asylum claims are approved either initially or eventually on appeal. And I mentioned earlier the backlog of claims. As the government is trying to meet its promise to clear this backlog, of course, they're processing claims more quickly. Now, this is resulting in two problems. At the one end, they're rejecting claims, or claims are being withdrawn on very tenuous grounds, which means that asylum seekers who are here, who still feel they've got a claim, are left without any support at all and become destitute and have to sleep rough. But also those whose claims are approved then become, in theory, eligible for help from local authorities because they're homeless. But many of them are single, so they're not regarded as vulnerable. They may try to prove that they've got health problems, and many of them have mental health problems because of their experiences as in leaving the countries that they've left. But local authorities are struggling to deal with the demand, and
and part of the problem, as the chapter notes, is that there's a shortage of low cost accommodation. Do you see this changing anytime soon?
It won't change anytime soon, but I think you asked me earlier if the problems about housing asylum seekers were to do with the administrative system or to do with housing shortages. And I think it's the crisis really has highlighted how acute the shortage of low-cost accommodation is. Now, local authorities in some cases are trying to remedy that by buying properties, and the government has instituted a small fund to buy properties, for example, for Ukrainian and Afghan refugees. But it's not enough. I mean, we really need, a big upscaling of our output of affordable housing, and probably curtailing the right to buy in the meantime to prevent any further leakage.
That leads me to my final question, which is, how much can realistically change without the delivery of much needed affordable housing?
I don't think there's going to be a radical change, but I think there has to be a change in the Home Office attitude towards asylum seekers, which is this attitude of this punitive attitude of putting them into disgraceful conditions in terms of the Bibi Stockholm barge. I see daily, because I'm part of a group which advises asylum seekers and other migrants. I see daily requests from asylum seekers who've been told they've got to move to the barge to say they feel desperate, they feel suicidal, they want to do everything in their power to avoid being sent to the barge. And the same applies to some of the remote RAF bases that the government are using, for example, in Wethersfield, where there's been a high incidence of suicide. So, in the short term, the government could stop this punitive action and could at least continue to provide semi-decent accommodation for asylum seekers.